The town where he was born lay in the gentle, sun-warmed hills of Roman North Africa, a place of stone houses and narrow streets where dust and light moved together through the day. People called it Thagaste, a small provincial town, neither famous nor powerful, where life followed a rhythm marked by market days, the changing seasons, and the distant authority of the empire. Around it lay fields of grain and vineyards, olive trees with their silvery leaves, and the slow paths worn by generations of feet and hooves. In this quiet corner of the world, a child was born in the year 354, a boy who would one day become known far beyond those hills, Augustine. You may imagine his family's house, partly Roman in style with a courtyard open to the sky, where water collected in a basin and the shadows slid softly over stone as the day advanced. His father, Patricius, was a small-town official of modest means, a pagan who cared greatly about respectability and the hope that his son might rise in the Roman world. His mother, Monica, was a Christian, her faith woven into the way she spoke, the way she moved through the house, the silent patience with which she carried both joys and sorrows. Between them, this boy grew, held by two different visions of what his life might become. From an early age, Augustine's mind showed a certain brightness, a quick ability to grasp words, to remember stories, to delight in the shape of language. He would sit quietly when adults spoke, his dark eyes attentive, following the flow of conversation even when he did not entirely understand. His mother watched him often, with a gaze both tender and thoughtful, as if she already sensed that this boy's restless mind would someday travel far from home before finding what it truly sought. In the early mornings, when mist sometimes lay low over the fields outside Thagaste, the town would slowly awaken. Vendors arranged their goods, animals stirred in their pens, children slipped from doorways to chase one another through the lanes before being called back to daily tasks. Augustine grew amid these sounds, the clatter of pottery, the murmur of Latin, and the local language mixed together, the distant ring of metal from a smith's shop, the quiet creak of wooden carts. Life was not grand, but it was steady, ordered by habit and necessity. Within the walls of his home, another rhythm unfolded, shaped by his mother's faith. She went to church, she prayed, she listened to scripture, and she tried, sometimes gently, sometimes with tears, to draw her family toward the God she loved. She taught Augustine simple prayers, told him stories from the Bible, and invited him to trust in a God who saw him and loved him. His father, standing somewhat apart from all this, wanted his son to succeed in the world as it was, to win honor, to shine in the courts and councils where words carried weight. Monica wanted him to belong fully to God. The child grew in the space between these hopes. At school, Augustine felt both the promise and the harshness of Roman education. The road to learning was not lined with kindness. Teachers used strict discipline, and sometimes he feared the rod more than he loved the lessons. Yet the world of words captivated him. He discovered how language could persuade, how stories could move the heart, how a well-turned phrase could sparkle like sunlight on water. Even when he tried to resist, this fascination drew him in. He would remember later how he disliked certain subjects, especially the rote memorization of Greek. Yet there was a deeper current, a growing love of eloquence, of the power that lies in speech. At home, he might sit near the doorway in the late afternoon, watching shadows lengthen across the courtyard, while Monica moved quietly about her tasks. Sometimes she would pause, perhaps resting a hand on his head, saying something simple about God's care, about the one who had created sun and sky and the very breath they shared. Augustine did not yet grasp the full meaning of her words, but the tone of her voice, The steadiness of her conviction planted something in him that would not entirely disappear, even when he later tried to turn away. There were games too, simple, local ones played in dusty streets with other children. There were small quarrels, laughter, teasing, the ordinary knots and threads of childhood friendships. Augustine remembered later how easily he joined in mischief, how he could be swept along by the approval of his companions. Even in those years, he sensed that within him were mixed currents, a desire for praise, a hunger to be admired, and a quieter desire for something more lasting, though he could not yet name it. The world he lived in carried its own tensions. The Roman Empire, though still strong, was no longer in its first youth. Rumors of troubles far away sometimes reached Thagaste, whispers of unrest, of rival powers pressing at its borders. Yet for a boy running along the paths outside town, the empire was an abstraction. While the earth beneath his feet, the sky overhead, the voices of his parents, the smell of baking bread in the streets, these were real and immediate. He felt the closeness of family and the quiet pressure of expectations. Patricius wanted his son to advance, to have the education he himself had never fully enjoyed. This meant sacrifices. The family was not wealthy, and paying for Augustine's schooling required effort and careful planning. At times, this ambition led to tension with Monica, who worried not only about her son's future in this world, but about his soul, about the company he kept, the ideas he absorbed, the direction of his desires. She believed that God had a claim on this child, a purpose for him beyond the admiration of crowds or the favor of the powerful. And so, Augustine's early years unfolded under a kind of quiet tug-of-war, though not always in open conflict. His father took pride in the boy's cleverness, boasting to others that his son would go far. His mother prayed, sometimes with tears, that this sharp mind would not be lost in disorder and pride. Augustine absorbed it all. His father's pride, his mother's tears, the shimmering promise of a larger world beyond Thagaste, and the subtler, deeper pull of questions that lingered under the surface of daily life. As he grew older, he began to sense in himself a certain restlessness. The familiar paths of his town, the routines of school, the rituals of the household, it was as though they formed a circle that he wanted, somehow, to step beyond. He felt a longing for more knowledge, more experience, more recognition, though he did not yet know what such more truly meant. In small ways, he began to lean toward the idea of leaving, of going to larger places where his talent might be noticed. In moments of quiet, perhaps at the end of the day when the house settled into stillness, Monica would continue her steady practice of prayer. Augustine would have seen her, perhaps kneeling, perhaps seated with eyes closed, lips moving silently. These were not dramatic moments, just part of the fabric of life, but they left an impression. There was a kind of strength in that quiet, a strength unlike the outward public honor that his father valued. It was as though two different kinds of greatness were present in his home, one measured in status and achievement, the other hidden, measured in faith and perseverance. The land itself seemed to share in these contrasts. Under bright midday sun, everything appeared clear, sharp-edged, almost harsh. Stones, walls, and fields lay open, without shadow. But as evening came, the sky softened and colors shifted. Coolness moved slowly over the earth. Augustine, as a boy, would have watched that daily change many times, the sky taking on deeper shades, the first stars appearing, the murmuring of voices quieting as lamps were lit indoors. He stepped into adolescence carried by such scenes, with the world around him both familiar and yet full of promise, as though it were always hinting at something more than could be touched or held. Those early years in Thagast did not yet contain the dramatic moments for which he is remembered. No famous sermon, no hard-won theological reflection, no detailed confession of his interior struggles. But they prepared the ground. In the interplay of his parents' hopes, in the discipline and discoveries of school, in the modest but real beauty of his North African town, the foundations were laid for a life that would one day reach far beyond those narrow streets. For now, he was still only a boy, gifted, impressionable, loved, and already, in ways he did not yet fully understand, being quietly led along the first steps of a long and winding journey. Carthage lay far from Thagast, across stretches of countryside and along roads that carried traders, officials, and students toward the sea. For a young man from a smaller town, the name itself held a kind of promise. Once the rival of Rome, now a great provincial city of the empire, Carthage was a place of bustling markets, crowded streets, and voices from many regions. When Augustine finally journeyed there to continue his studies, he stepped into a world that felt larger, louder, and more dazzling than anything he had known before. You can picture him arriving, a thin, observant young man, carrying more hopes than possessions. The harbor would have been alive with ships and the smells of salt and tar, while farther inland the city's life gathered in narrow streets and open squares. Here the air was filled with shouting vendors, the rhythms of different dialects, the clink of coins, the fragrance of spices and cooked food. It was a place where the Roman world showed its complexity and size, and Augustine moved into it with eyes wide open. He came to Carthage to study rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech, which held the key to public life in the empire. Young men like him learned to argue cases, to praise, to blame, to move audiences with carefully chosen words. A successful rhetor could hope for high offices, the favor of the powerful, and the respect of society. For Augustine, whose father had sacrificed much to give him this opportunity, success meant not only personal advancement, but the fulfillment of family hopes. Behind him, like a quiet shadow, lay Monica's prayers, her deep desire that in all his learning he would not lose sight of God. The city's energy impressed him. Carthage had theaters, baths, public buildings, and schools. Students gathered in groups, debating loudly, laughing, making plans, forming friendships and rivalries. Augustine found himself among them, swept into a new social world where wit and charm could lift one's standing, and where the approval of others felt both intoxicating and fragile. He discovered how quickly a clever phrase could travel through a circle of students, how laughter could become a kind of currency, and how easy it was to measure his worth by the attention he received. Yet amid this human noise, he also found loneliness. Even surrounded by people, there were times when he felt as though something within him remained unfulfilled, a quiet inner chamber that the noise could not quite reach. He sought relief in the pleasures that Carthage offered, the theater with its passionate performances, social gatherings, and romantic relationships. He entered into a lasting relationship with a woman whose name he never recorded, but who remained at his side for many years and bore him a son, Adeodatus. Their life together, though not dignified by the legal forms of marriage, carried its own depth of affection, shared daily life, and quiet joys and sorrows. The theater drew him powerfully. There, the emotions of the actors, the rise and fall of the plot, the cries and sighs of the audience, created a world of intense feeling. Augustine later remembered how he could be moved to tears by scenes on the stage, even while his own life went unchanged. He was fascinated by this capacity of stories and performances to stir the heart, and yet he would one day look back with a certain sadness at how easily he surrendered himself to these passing passions. At the time, however, the theater was one of the bright lights of Carthage. An escape, a delight, a shared experience that drew him together with others. In the classrooms, the discipline of rhetoric continued to refine his gift with words. He practiced speeches, memorized texts, and learned how to shape arguments. Sometimes the noise of fellow students made teaching difficult. There were rivalries and disturbances, bursts of laughter, and moments of tension. Augustine could find himself both drawn into and wearied by this environment. He wanted success, and to obtain it, he needed to master the skills that would earn him admiration. He moved through this system with growing confidence, feeling his abilities strengthen. One day, however, his path took a more inward turn through the encounter with a book. He read a work of Cicero called Hortensius, a text urging the love of wisdom. The effect on him was profound. It was not that the book taught him the Christian faith. Its content was philosophical, not religious in that sense, but it awakened in him a new kind of desire. As he read, something in his heart stirred, a longing not only for eloquence, but for truth itself. The book seemed to call him beyond mere success towards something higher, something that could satisfy the mind at a deeper level. He later described this as a turning point. Until then, he had wanted mainly to shine in the eyes of others, to be praised for his talent, to rise in the world. After reading Hortensius, he began to feel that wisdom, the knowledge of what is truly real and good, was worth seeking for its own sake. Yet this newly awakened desire did not immediately lead him to the faith his mother loved. Instead, he looked for wisdom in various currents of thought that flowed through Carthage, and one of these was the doctrine of the Manichaeans. Manichaeism offered him a structured explanation of the world's struggle between good and evil. It spoke of light and darkness, of conflicting powers, and presented itself as a religion for the intellectually serious. To a mind troubled by questions of suffering and sin, and embarrassed by what seemed to be the simple stories of Scripture, Manichaeism appeared sophisticated, even liberating. Augustine hoped he had found something that matched both his desire for rational clarity and his longing for a meaningful account of reality. He attached himself to this group and remained with them for years, convinced for a time that he had found an answer. In the bustling streets of Carthage, in its classrooms and private gatherings, Augustine carried on this new allegiance. He was still a student of rhetoric, still a young man with friends, ambitions, and romantic ties, but now also a seeker who believed he had found a community that respected reason and offered a clear answer to the problems of existence. When he thought of his mother's faith, it seemed to him, at least for a while, too modest, too tied to stories that he felt he had outgrown. He did not realize that beneath her simple trust lay a depth that his restless intellect had not yet fully explored. Yet, even amid the apparent certainty he found in Manichaean teaching, unease slowly grew. Questions arose that his new teachers could not easily answer. The world's complexity did not always fit their neat explanations. He observed them closely, listening to the way they spoke, comparing their promises with his experience. While he still identified with them, cracks began to appear in the structure of belief he had embraced. Meanwhile, his life in Carthage continued its outward course. He taught, he studied, he enjoyed the pleasures of companionship and love. His son, Adeodatus, was born, a small life that added both responsibility and tenderness to his days. In the evenings, when the city's clamor softened and lamps burned in quiet interiors, Augustine would have held his child, watched him sleep, and felt the delicate weight of his existence. There was love here, gentle and real, in the midst of Augustine's tangled thoughts and ambitions. Still, a restlessness remained. The city's bright lights no longer dazzled him as they once had. He had tasted its pleasures, felt the thrill of applause, found temporary shelter in a system of thought that claimed to answer everything, and yet, as time passed, an emptiness persisted. Carthage had given him much: education, friendships, a family, intellectual stimulation. But it had also revealed the limits of what success and human ideas could offer to a heart that, without fully understanding why, longed for something unchanging. The years in Carthage thus formed a kind of crossroads in his life. On one side stood the desires that had first brought him there: fame, eloquence, the admiration of others, the delight of shared pleasures. On another stood the newly awakened longing for wisdom, which had led him into Manichaeism, but now stirred questions that the system did not completely satisfy. And somewhere far away, in Thagast, his mother continued to pray, trusting that the God she loved could reach her son even in a great, noisy city, amid all the distractions that pulled at his attention. Slowly, the sense grew in Augustine that he would not remain here forever. The city that once seemed like a destination began to feel more like a step along the way. There were opportunities elsewhere, rumors of better prospects in other parts of the empire, especially in Italy. As these possibilities took shape in his mind, the Carthaginian years settled into their place. A bright, restless chapter marked by excitement and disappointment, by deep attachments and quiet dissatisfaction, by the first serious stirring of a mind that, without fully knowing it yet, was searching for a truth greater than his own thoughts and a peace deeper than any applause. The years that followed in Carthage carried Augustine more deeply into the path he had chosen, or thought he had chosen, in his search for wisdom. The love awakened in him by Cicero's words did not fade. It only shifted its object. He did not yet know how to seek wisdom in the scriptures his mother cherished, and so he looked instead to teachings that presented themselves as clear, orderly, and rational. Among these, the Manichaeans seemed to him for a time the most promising. Their explanations moved along neat lines. The world, they said, was shaped by a cosmic struggle between light and darkness, good and evil, almost as though there were two principles, two realms, opposed to one another. Human beings were caught in the midst of this conflict, with particles of light imprisoned in bodies made from darker, resistant material. To Augustine's inquiring mind, troubled by the presence of suffering and by his own divided desires, this system offered an answer that was, at least at first, surprisingly satisfying. It seemed to explain why he experienced a tug-of-war within himself, why he felt drawn toward what was good and yet often acted against what he believed best. He admired the way Manichaean teachers spoke of reason. They did not ask him to accept mysteries he could not comprehend. They promised a faith that would be fully rational, a doctrine that would satisfy both the mind and the heart. For a young man proud of his intellect, this was deeply attractive. He wanted a religion that would bow to argument, a belief system that would not require him to descend from the heights of clever speech and philosophical inquiry. In the Manichaeans, he believed he had found such a path, and he stepped onto it with a kind of relief. For nearly 9 years, their teaching shaped his outlook. He attended their meetings, discussed their ideas with his friends, and defended their positions with the skill of a trained rhetorician. When he thought of the scriptures his mother loved, he did so with a certain distance, considering them too simple, perhaps even crude in places, not worthy of the full power of his awakened mind. He did not yet see that the simplicity he dismissed might coexist with depths he had not yet learned to explore. At that time, he was more inclined to trust explanations that flattered his sense of being intelligent explanations that allowed him to feel part of a select circle of the enlightened. Still, even within this apparent certainty, his mind did not entirely sleep. He carried questions with him wherever he went. As he walked through the streets of Carthage, past the busy markets and along the colonnades, he would turn over in his thoughts the nature of good and evil, the reasons for human weakness, the meaning of freedom. The Manichaean framework seemed at first to tidy these questions into clear compartments. But as time passed, Augustine's questions grew more pointed. He began to notice places where life did not fit so easily into the outlines he had been given. One figure, in particular, came to symbolize his hopes and his growing disappointment: a Manichaean teacher named Faustus, renowned among his followers as a wise and learned man, skilled in argument, elegant in speech. For a long time, Augustine heard of Faustus as someone who could resolve the doubts that troubled the more thoughtful members of the community. Whenever Augustine found a difficulty in Manichaean teaching, whenever a passage from the scriptures or a philosophical argument from outside seemed to challenge their system, he was told, "Wait until Faustus comes. He will answer these questions. He will explain everything." And so Augustine waited, carrying his questions like quiet companions. While he continued to argue for Manichaeism in public, in his heart he preserved certain reservations, setting them aside, trusting that the arrival of this famous teacher would bring clarity. He imagined a man whose knowledge would be deep enough to satisfy his restless mind, a guide who would bring together reason and faith in a way that would finally bring him peace. When at last Faustus arrived in Carthage, Augustine went to hear him with a mixture of excitement and hope. The teacher did not disappoint in outward appearance. He was gracious, modest, fluent, charming in his speech. Augustine recognized in him a certain refinement, a gift of expression that he, as a student of rhetoric, could not fail to appreciate. Faustus spoke with ease. He knew how to hold an audience, how to present himself as thoughtful and moderate. In the first moments, Augustine's admiration was genuine. He felt himself in the presence of someone who had traveled farther on the path he sought. But as their conversations deepened, a different impression began to form. When Augustine gently brought forward his most troubling questions, the ones he had been saving for this meeting, he discovered that Faustus could not answer them in the way he had hoped. The teacher's eloquence did not conceal the limits of his understanding. He was honest enough to admit when he did not know something, and Augustine appreciated this honesty, but the effect on his own faith in Manichaeism was quietly devastating. The authority he had expected to strengthen his beliefs instead revealed their fragility. It was as if the scaffolding that had supported his thoughts for years suddenly appeared thin and poorly built. The neat explanations of light and darkness, good and evil, began to seem less like profound insights and more like oversimplifications. The problems of the world, the complexity of human experience, the dignity and mystery of the material universe, these no longer fit so well within the diagrams he had once admired. His mind, which had always been restless, now found itself without a safe place to rest inside the system he had embraced. This realization did not lead him immediately to another faith. Instead, it opened a kind of interior distance. Outwardly, Augustine continued for a while to be associated with the Manichaeans. His friendships, his routines, his social position, all were still tied to this group. But inside, he felt himself moving away, step by slow step. He ceased to believe as fully as before. He carried a growing sense of disappointment, a quiet sadness that what had once seemed like a clear, shining path now appeared uncertain and incomplete. At the same time, his heart remained divided by other attachments. He loved his companion, the mother of his son, and the life they had built together. even if that life did not align with the ideals of the church his mother represented. He enjoyed conversation, laughter, the small pleasures of ordinary days. He still sought honor and success in his profession. The break with Manichaeism, therefore, was not a clean, swift movement, but a gradual loosening of ties, complicated by affection and habit. He did not yet know where to turn instead, and so he lingered on the threshold, no longer fully believing, not yet ready to give up the community that had shaped so many of his adult years. In the quiet of his own thoughts, he began to turn again to philosophy, seeking in different schools what Manichaeism had failed to provide. The writings of certain Platonist thinkers would later open in him vistas of interior contemplation, and the notion of a reality beyond the visible world, more solid and more real than anything grasped by the senses alone. But those influences were still ahead of him. For now, he stood in between, dissatisfied with his current path, uncertain of the next. The disappointment with Faustus and the gradual fading of his Manichaean enthusiasm also softened, in a subtle way, his attitude toward the faith of his childhood. The scriptures he had once dismissed as crude stories began to appear, not yet convincing, but not entirely contemptible. He still struggled with their style, with passages that seemed to him strange or unrefined compared to the philosophical works he admired. Yet the proud confidence with which he had once rejected them began to waver. The conviction that reason alone, shaped by human systems, could grasp all truth started to feel less firm under his feet. Around him, the city of Carthage went on with its daily noise. Students debated in porticos, merchants sold their goods, children ran through streets bright with afternoon sun. Ships came and went in the harbor, carrying news and people from far across the sea. In this world of movement and change, Augustine's interior life deepened in its questions. He had sought explanations for evil and suffering. He had wanted a faith that would never ask him to bow before mystery. Now he found himself face to face with the limits of his chosen teachers, and through that experience, the limits of his own understanding. These years of seeking, of embracing and slowly releasing Manichaeism, left a mark on him that he would never forget. Later, he would look back with both regret and a kind of gratitude. Regret for the time spent wandering, for the influence he had on others while advocating beliefs he would later abandon. Gratitude that even in those wanderings, his desire for truth had not fully died. The disappointments did not erase the longing that had driven him from the beginning. Instead, they purified it, slowly turning it away from systems that promised too much and delivered too little. Somewhere beyond his sight, his mother still prayed. She did not know every detail of his intellectual journey, every argument he rehearsed in his mind. She only knew that her son was far away, both physically and spiritually, and that his life was entangled in beliefs she could not share. Yet she continued her quiet plea that God would lead him out of error into a light he did not yet recognize. In a way he could not yet imagine, the disappointment he now felt would be one of the steps along that path, a gentle loosening of his attachment to answers that had seemed solid but could not withstand the full weight of his questions. The story was not yet one of resolution. Augustine remained for the moment a seeker whose chosen guides had failed him, a teacher with a brilliant mind and a divided heart, a man standing at the edge of a belief he no longer trusted, peering out into a future that had not yet revealed its shape. His search for wisdom, briefly satisfied and now unsettled again, was quietly preparing him for further journeys and for encounters in distant cities that would call him deeper into the mystery he still approached from afar. Rome, when he first imagined it, did not seem like a real place so much as a distant concentration of all that he desired, the heart of the empire, the center of learning and power, a city whose name alone stirred ambition in the minds of young men trained in rhetoric. From Carthage, he had heard stories of its seriousness, its discipline, its opportunities. Compared to the noisy, sometimes unruly student life he knew in Africa, Rome appeared almost like a promise of order, of more refined company, of a stage worthy of his talent. There were practical reasons for leaving. In Carthage, he had grown weary of the disruptions and mischief of his students, who sometimes behaved more like rowdy crowds than eager learners. The work that should have been noble, guiding minds through words, was often disturbed by their restlessness. He longed for an environment where students came not merely to make noise, but to truly study. When a chance arose to go to Rome, he took it, encouraged by promises of better-behaved pupils and greater prospects. The journey itself was a kind of turning point. He crossed the sea, leaving behind the familiar coastline of North Africa, with its sunlit fields and the streets of Carthage he knew so well. The water stretched before him, vast and shifting, and he sailed toward a city he had never seen, but had long held in his mind. Around him, sailors worked in practiced motions. The boat rose and fell with the waves. And somewhere behind, in a town called Tagaste, his mother wept and prayed, having been left behind with a pain that pierced her more deeply, because she feared not only the distance of land and water, but the widening distance of beliefs and choices. Arriving in Rome, Augustine found a city different in tone from Carthage. The streets were still busy, the markets still noisy, but there was a certain reserve, a seriousness in the air. Many students there were indeed more disciplined, but there was also a hidden practice that troubled him. They were known to abandon their teachers suddenly, avoiding payment by slipping away to another school. The outward order concealed an interior instability of its own. He had hoped that Rome would give him peace in his profession. Instead, he discovered a different set of disappointments. Still, the city drew him in. Its baths, public buildings, and the stories carried from all parts of the empire gave it a sense of weight and authority. He continued to teach, to polish his speeches, to seek recognition among those who valued eloquence. He met members of the Manichaean community in Rome too, and for a time he moved among them, still tied by old allegiances, even as his doubts persisted. He was not ready to stand alone without any group, without any defined set of answers, and so he remained loosely attached, his outward life moving along familiar lines, his inner thoughts quietly shifting. During his time in Rome, he fell seriously ill. The details of the sickness are not known in all their specifics, but it was enough to bring him near to death. The lively discussions, the pursuit of advancement, the ambitions that had carried him across the sea, all were suddenly overshadowed by the frailty of his body. In such moments, when the future seems uncertain and death no longer a distant idea, deeper questions rise unbidden. Augustine later remembered this period as one in which he almost slipped from this world, yet he recovered. The experience did not immediately transform his life, but it left an imprint, a reminder that all his plans rested on a foundation more fragile than he liked to admit. As he regained his strength, another opportunity emerged, one that would pull him further along the road that measured success by closeness to power. The imperial court at Milan needed a professor of rhetoric, someone to teach and deliver official speeches, a position of considerable honor. Through the help of influential contacts, Augustine was recommended and eventually chosen. To be summoned from Rome to serve as imperial rhetor in Milan was no small thing. It meant that his gift with words had been recognized at a high level, that he would now move among those closer to the center of political and administrative life in the Western Empire. The journey from Rome to Milan led him north, away from the Mediterranean climate he had always known, toward a city that combined Roman authority with the changing realities of a world in transition. Milan, at that time, functioned in many ways as a capital of the western part of the empire. Emperors lived there, officials worked there, and great bishops preached in its churches. For Augustine, this move promised not only professional advancement, but entry into circles he had long desired to approach. He arrived in Milan with the sense of stepping once more into a larger arena. The streets were different from those of Rome and Carthage, the air cooler, the atmosphere colored by the presence of the imperial court. He took up his new post, preparing and delivering speeches, teaching young men who, like himself not long before, saw rhetoric as a path to honor. The duties were demanding but flattering. He could feel himself recognized, his career advancing along a trajectory that would have pleased his father, perhaps even impressed those who had once known him as a boy in Thagast. Yet the interior restlessness did not entirely sleep. The questions awakened by Cicero, the disappointment with Manichaeism, the awareness of his own divided heart. All this traveled with him. In Milan, he did not suddenly become a different person. He still enjoyed refined company, intellectual conversation, and the comforts of his domestic life. His long-standing companion had traveled with him, and their son, Adeodatus, was there as well. They formed a small household far from home, a fragile island of familiarity amid the vast, shifting sea of imperial affairs. And in Milan, there was another presence, one that would soon touch his life in a quiet but decisive way. The bishop of the city, a man named Ambrose. Augustine first heard of him in terms that would naturally appeal to a rhetorician. Ambrose was said to be a gifted speaker, a man whose sermons drew crowds not only for their content, but for their style. Curious, Augustine went to listen, not as someone seeking faith, but as a professional interested in the craft of eloquence. He wanted to hear how this bishop spoke, how he shaped his phrases, how he moved his audience. Sitting among the congregation, Augustine listened with the ear of an orator. At first he admired not the message but the form, the rhythm of the words, the structure of the arguments, the way Ambrose handled the scriptures with a confidence and depth that Augustine had not encountered before. Slowly, something else began to happen. Beyond the elegance of the sermons, he sensed a different kind of wisdom at work, a way of interpreting the sacred texts that opened them up, revealing layers he had never considered. The stories he had once dismissed as crude began, under Ambrose's explanations, to show a richness he had not suspected. In these early days in Milan, however, Augustine remained very much a man in between. He had not yet let go of all connections to Manichaeism. He still entertained its questions, even as he steadily moved away from its answers. He admired Ambrose, but did not yet share his faith. He continued to pursue success in his position, yet felt a growing weariness with the idea that public honor could ever fully satisfy the desire that had been stirred in him years ago in Carthage. The city around him reflected the tensions of his own life. Imperial grandeur standing alongside signs of political and social fragility, the outward stability of order hiding inner uncertainties. As time passed, the circle of his acquaintances in Milan widened. He met men who, unlike his former Manichaean companions, were serious Christians and thoughtful thinkers. Among them were figures who introduced him to works of philosophy that bore the marks of Platonist thought, texts that spoke of an invisible, unchangeable reality beyond the world grasped by the senses. For a mind like Augustine's, these writings had a strong appeal. They seemed to offer a way of thinking about God and the soul that was both intellectually demanding and deeply suggestive, opening doors toward an understanding of the divine more subtle than the images he had rejected in his youth. By day, He continued his duties, composing speeches, teaching, taking part in the life expected of someone in his position. By evening, he might sit in a quieter space, a book open before him, turning over in his mind the ideas he encountered. The noise of students and court attendants faded, replaced by the inner movement of thought. He was beginning, without fully realizing it, to inhabit two worlds at once: the public world of rhetoric and official duty, and the interior world of seeking, where questions of truth and meaning pressed more urgently against the walls of his heart. Ambition had brought him to Milan, and outwardly he had obtained what many would envy: a respected post, intellectual peers, a household with those he loved. Yet the wandering of his mind had not ceased. If anything, it grew more intense in this new city. The distance from his homeland, the memories of Carthage, the near-death illness in Rome, the disappointment in Faustus, the quiet dignity of Ambrose, the philosophical texts that spoke of a transcendent reality. All these elements wove together, forming a tapestry of influences that gently drew him toward a place he could not yet name. For now, he remained poised on the edge of a deeper turning, still caught in the currents of ambition, still concerned about worldly success, yet increasingly haunted by the sense that no position, however honored, could finally bring rest to a heart that was made for more than applause. The city of Milan, with its mixture of imperial pomp and Christian worship, of offices and basilicas, of court intrigue and quiet prayer, became the setting in which this inner tension would come to its sharpest point, preparing Augustine for the voices that would soon speak more clearly to him of a truth he had long unconsciously sought. In the midst of his duties in Milan, where official speeches and lessons in rhetoric marked his days, other, quieter voices began to press in upon Augustine's life. Some of them were old and familiar, like the memory of his mother's words and tears. Others were new and unexpected, like the voice of Ambrose preaching in the great basilica, or the silent testimony of friends who lived with a kind of integrity and peace he could not help but notice. As these voices surrounded him, his inner landscape began slowly to change, little by little, like a shoreline reshaped by a tide that returns each day without fanfare. His relationship with his mother, Monica, had always been threaded with both affection and pain. She loved him fiercely, prayed for him constantly, and suffered deeply when his choices carried him far from the faith she held so dear. Long before Milan, in earlier years, there had been moments of sharp conflict between them, when his adherence to Manichaean teaching and his refusal to accept baptism had wounded her. There had been a time when, in her distress, she would not even allow him into her house until a dream and the counsel of a bishop changed her mind and restored him to her home, if not yet to her faith. Through all this, her love had never disappeared. It continued like a low, steady flame, sometimes nearly hidden, never entirely gone. When she eventually followed him to Italy, crossing the sea despite her age and the fatigue of travel, she did so not as someone seeking worldly opportunity, but as a mother unable to let go of the hope that her son would one day turn toward God. Arriving in Milan, she stepped into a world very different from Thagaste or Carthage, a city of imperial courts and complex politics, where bishops and emperors sometimes stood side by side, sometimes in tension, and where the Christian faith had taken on a public, visible shape in grand churches and solemn ceremonies. Monica moved through that world with the same simplicity that had marked her in smaller towns, her heart fixed on the same intention as always: to pray, to hope, and to love. Augustine's life in Milan, seen from the outside, might have seemed complete. He held a respected position as an imperial rhetor. He had influential patrons. He enjoyed the company of friends. He lived with his long-standing companion and his son, Adeodatus. was growing into a young man of remarkable intelligence and sensitivity. Yet beneath this surface, an unease continued. The teachings of the Manichaeans had largely lost their hold on him. He no longer defended them with youthful confidence. The philosophical texts influenced by Platonist thought had stirred him deeply, lifting his mind toward the idea of a transcendent, immaterial reality, presenting God not as a material being extended in space, but as the source of all being, truth, and beauty. This opened new horizons and gave him glimpses of a reality that seemed both lofty and intimate. But these insights did not yet resolve his questions. He could conceive of a God who was utterly real and spiritual, who gave being to all things, and yet he still felt trapped by habits and desires he could not master. He admired the heights of philosophical thought and yet lived a life that, in many ways, remained tied to the comforts and honors of this world. The distance between what he could think and what he could do grew painful. He began to see more clearly his own divided will, the way he could say, "I should change," and yet remain chained to familiar patterns. This tension would later become one of the most famous elements of his own reflections on the human heart. But at the time, it simply meant that his days were shadowed by a quiet, persistent dissatisfaction. In this state, he continued to listen to Ambrose. At first, as he had admitted, he went to the bishop's sermon simply to admire his eloquence. But week after week, as he sat among the congregation, the words sank deeper. Ambrose had a way of reading the scriptures that differed greatly from anything Augustine had heard before. He did not treat the sacred texts as childish stories to be taken only at their most literal and superficial level. He unfolded them symbolically, historically, and morally, revealing layers of meaning. Passages that had once offended Augustine's sense of refinement, or struck him as unworthy of philosophical attention, now seemed to shimmer with a different kind of light. Through Ambrose, Augustine discovered that the Christian faith could be intellectually serious. The bishop did not separate reason from belief. He brought them into conversation, showing how the God of the Scriptures could also be the God glimpsed in a more veiled way by philosophers. For a man like Augustine, who feared that accepting Christianity would mean turning his back on his intellect, this discovery was crucial. It did not lead him immediately to faith, but it loosened one of the chains that had held him back. The belief that the church could not speak to a mind like his. Outside the basilica, life in the city continued. There were meals shared with friends, conversations that moved lightly from serious topics to jokes and back again, walks through streets lined with shops and workshops. In these ordinary moments, Augustine observed something else, the quiet strength of those who already lived the faith he was only beginning to reconsider. Some of his acquaintances led lives marked by restraint, charity, and a serenity that did not depend on status or pleasure. They were not without struggles, but there was in them a kind of inner coherence that contrasted sharply with his own divided self. Meanwhile, Monica, living now in the same city as her son, continued her patient efforts. She attended Ambrose's church faithfully, listened to the same sermons, drew comfort from the bishop's kindness. Ambrose himself recognized the depth of her devotion and spoke well of her to Augustine, who could not remain entirely unmoved by the respect this serious, learned man showed his mother. The love he felt for her, combined with the esteem in which Ambrose held her, created another strand in the cord drawing him toward the faith he still hesitated to embrace. The household in Milan was not without its own inner shifts. Even as Augustine grew more impressed by the Christian intellectual tradition, he remained bound by his personal attachments. His companion, with whom he had shared many years, and who was the mother of his child, occupied a central place in his heart. Yet, under the influence of social expectations and ambitions, plans began to form for a marriage that would secure his position more firmly among the Roman elite. Such a marriage required a bride of a certain social standing, chosen not simply for affection, but for alliance. The woman with whom he had built a life did not fit this role in the eyes of society, and so a painful decision eventually took shape. She would be sent away. When the time came for this separation, it cut deeply. She returned to Africa, and Augustine later wrote that his heart, wounded by the loss, clung painfully to the absence she left behind.
Adeodatus remained with him, a living reminder of the bond that had been broken. This sorrow did not immediately teach him the lesson he would later draw from it. Instead, he sought comfort, for a time, in another relationship. Yet the experience had quietly exposed the tangled nature of his attachments, how his desires for love, respectability, and advancement could pull him in different directions, leaving him feeling both guilty and unfree. All the while, the voices around him continued their work. Friends told him stories of people who had made radical choices for the sake of faith, renouncing worldly honors to live in simplicity. One day, he heard the account of two court officials who, after reading about the life of Saint Anthony of Egypt, decided to abandon their positions and embrace a more withdrawn, ascetic existence. The story struck him with particular force. If men not unlike himself, educated and situated within the structures of imperial life, could take such a step, what excuse remained for his own hesitation? The question did not leave him in peace. Ambrose's preaching, the example of believers in his circle, the philosophical texts he read, the tears and prayers of his mother, the stories of sudden generous conversions, all these elements gathered like clouds on the horizon of his soul. At first, they floated there, separated, each one a single influence. But as time passed, they began to join, forming a heavier, more pressing weight in his conscience. He admired the faith he saw in others. He recognized its intellectual depth. He felt its moral beauty, and yet he still held back, afraid of what it would demand of him, of what he would have to surrender. In moments of solitude, when the duties of the day were done and the city quieted, he turned his gaze inward. He saw within himself a will no longer divided simply between ignorance and knowledge, but between wanting and not wanting, between the call to a new life and the fear of losing the familiar comforts and honors of the old. He could say sincerely that he wanted to follow the path he saw in Christ, and at the same time, he could feel in himself a powerful reluctance to let go of the bonds that held him. This contradiction distressed him more than any philosophical puzzle. Monica, aware of his inner struggle more by intuition and love than by precise information, continued to pray and to encourage him. She rejoiced that he had drawn closer to Ambrose, that he had ceased to defend Manichaeism, that he now respected the scriptures he had once scorned. Each small step seemed to her a sign that the long-awaited day of his conversion might not be so distant. Yet she did not know when or how that day would come. She only knew that her part was to remain faithfully at his side as far as he allowed, and to entrust what she could not change to the mercy of God. In this way, Milan became the city of his slow turning. Not a sudden change, not yet the decisive moment that would later be remembered in detail, but a gradual reorientation of mind and heart, like a great ship that takes a long time to alter its course upon the sea. The voices of faith, Ambrose's sermons, the witness of friends, the example of saints, the tears of his mother, did not shout. They spoke steadily, persistently, until he could no longer pretend not to hear. The day was coming when these many influences would converge in a more dramatic scene in a garden, but for now, they formed the background music of his life, an insistent, gentle melody that would not leave him in peace until his heart answered it more fully. The turning, when it finally came, did not begin with thunder or spectacle, but with a weight that had grown almost unbearable within him. For a long time now, Augustine had been circling the same questions, circling the same invitation. He already knew, with increasing clarity, what path lay before him. He had seen the beauty of the Christian life in the words of Ambrose and the example of believers around him. He had lost faith in the teachings he once defended and had come to recognize the shallowness of many of his ambitions. Yet knowing what he ought to do and actually doing it were two very different things, and it was in the space between those two that his agony lived. He would later describe in detail how, during this time, his heart felt divided, as though two wills fought within him. One wanted to cling to the familiar comforts, honor, social standing, the pleasure of praise, the warmth of romantic attachment. The other wanted to follow the call of Christ, to embrace a life of humility, chastity, and trust in God. It was not that he did not understand the call. He did, and that much knowledge made the struggle sharper. He could no longer pretend ignorance. Instead, he found himself saying, "Soon, yes, soon I will change, only not yet." As if he could bargain with time itself, asking for just a little more delay. The stories he had heard of sudden conversions haunted him. The tale of the two court officials who, upon reading about St. Anthony, had left behind their positions to live in radical simplicity, pressed on his conscience like a gentle but unrelenting hand. "What are we doing?" he remembered them saying in the story. "The unlearned rise up and take heaven by storm, and we, with all our knowledge, remain here timid and ashamed." Those words echoed in Augustine's memory, turning into questions he could not escape. Why, with all his learning and insight, did he remain so weak, so divided, so afraid to act? One day, while visiting a friend named Simplicianus, an older Christian who had once guided Ambrose himself, Augustine heard another story that would carve itself deeply into his heart. Simplicianus told him of Victorinus, a famous rhetorician in Rome, celebrated for his translations and his skill. Victorinus, after secretly reading the scriptures and coming to believe, had finally found the courage to profess his faith publicly, asking to be baptized in the presence of the Christian community. When the story reached the moment where the assembled faithful welcomed Victorinus with joy, Augustine felt something ignite within him. If such a man, so honored in Roman society, could humble himself and step forward as a Christian, what held Augustine back? The question followed him home. It went with him into his room, into his thoughts, into the quiet spaces where he could no longer distract himself with official duties. He began to experience, more intensely, the sense that his life could not go on as before. It was as though he stood on a narrow bridge between two lands. Behind him, the world of his old habits, beliefs, and ambitions. Before him, the unknown country of a fully Christian life. He felt called forward, yet still clung to the railings, afraid to take the next step. In that same period, his inner conflict reached a kind of breaking point one afternoon in a garden attached to the house where he was staying. With him was his close friend Alypius, a companion who had walked beside him through many phases of his journey. The house itself stood quiet, its usual sounds softened by the stillness of the day. The garden, with its trees and patches of earth, offered a measure of privacy. The air was warm, the sky clear, and the leaves stirred gently overhead. It was an ordinary place, but on that day, it became the setting for an extraordinary decision. Before they went outside, Augustine found himself speaking with Alypius about the state of his soul, about the battle inside him. He poured out his confusion and frustration, confessing that he felt dragged in two directions, unable to be fully at peace in either. His words carried the strain of someone who had long postponed an important choice, and now found postponement almost impossible. When the conversation overwhelmed him, he left Alypius in the house and stepped alone into the garden, carrying a heart heavy with sorrow and longing. There, away from the immediate presence of his friend, the struggle intensified. He looked at himself with unsparing honesty. He saw the pattern of his life, the years spent chasing honors, the long attachment to desires he could not control, the repeated promises to change soon that had come to nothing. A wave of self-disgust rose in him, mixed with a deep, aching desire to be different. It felt as though a chain held him, not of iron, but of habits and fears, and he wept at the thought that he, who had so often prided himself on his freedom, had become a stranger to his own will. He moved to the base of a fig tree and collapsed beneath it, his tears finally breaking free. There, sitting on the ground, his face in his hands, he allowed his sorrow to pour out. He was not ashamed to weep. The struggle had become too great. He cried out to God in words that were not polished or rhetorical, but raw and honest. He asked why he continued to say, "tomorrow" and "soon" instead of "now." He begged for the strength to break free from the web he had woven around himself. It was a prayer born not of theory, but of the very depths of his heart. In the midst of this storm of emotion, as he wept and struggled, a strange and gentle sound reached him. From a nearby house or garden, he was never quite sure from where, he heard the voice of a child, or perhaps two children, chanting a simple phrase in a sing-song tone. "Take and read, take and read." The words seemed like a game, the kind of refrain children might use in play, yet they fell upon his ears with an unusual clarity. "Tolle, lege," they sounded in his memory, like a small bell struck repeatedly in a quiet room. He had never heard such a game before, he later said, and he took the words as a sign, a kind of gentle instruction. The suddenness of it met the need of the moment. Rising from the ground, brushing the tears from his face but still deeply moved, he interpreted the voice as a call to open the scriptures and let them speak to his situation. He returned quickly to where he had left his things, where a copy of the letters of St. Paul lay. Opening the book at random, with the simplest of intentions, to read the first passage his eyes fell upon, he bent his gaze down and began to read. The words that met him spoke of laying aside revelry and impurity, leaving behind jealousy and strife, and putting on a new way of life in Christ. They were not gentle suggestions, but clear exhortations to leave the old, disordered habits and step into a different kind of existence. As he read, he felt as though the text did not simply describe a moral ideal, but addressed him personally, in that very moment, in that particular garden, beneath the echo of the child's voice. The reading seemed to gather all the strands of his struggle, the years of seeking, the disappointments, the stories of conversion, the preaching of Ambrose, the prayers of his mother, and weave them into a single luminous thread. He did not need to read further. It was as though a light, soft and steady, entered the room of his soul, dispelling shadows that had lingered for years. The chain of hesitation, which had felt so strong only moments before, loosened. He experienced, in that instant, a change not manufactured by his own effort, but given. The fear of leaving his old life behind, the dread of a future without the comforts he had known, receded before a deeper certainty, that the path he had long resisted was the path of truth, and that to follow it would not be to lose everything, but to finally find what his heart had always sought. He closed the book, marking the place, and went back to Alypius with a face transformed by peace and resolve. He told his friend what had happened, what he had read, and how the struggle had ended. Alypius, in turn, looked into the same pages and found words that spoke to his own situation, leading him as well to a renewed and deepened commitment. The two friends, once companions in restlessness, now stood together on the threshold of a new life, prepared at last to ask for baptism and to let go of ambitions that had defined them for so long. When Monica heard of her son's decision, her joy was quiet but profound. For years she had prayed, sometimes with tears that seemed to have no end. She had followed him across the sea, endured periods of misunderstanding, trusted promises that seemed endlessly delayed. Now, at last, the day she had longed for had arrived. Augustine had not only drawn nearer to the church, he had resolved to enter fully, to receive the sacrament he had postponed, to give his life to the God she had always believed was guiding him, even when he wandered. After the garden episode, the steps toward baptism began to take shape. Augustine knew that the decision he had made would require changes that touched every aspect of his life. He resigned his position as imperial rhetor, refusing to continue in the role that had so often fed his pride and tied him to ambitions he now wished to leave behind. The world of public applause, of refined praise and carefully crafted official speeches began to recede from him. He did not yet know exactly what form his new life would take, but he knew it would not be built upon the old thirst for honor. He retreated for a time with a small group of friends and family to a quieter place outside Milan in preparation for baptism. There, in a more peaceful setting, he spent his days in conversation, prayer, and reflection, letting the decision made in the garden sink deeper into his being. The scriptures he had once scorned now became a source of light. The Psalms, in particular, spoke to him with a power that surprised and delighted him. Where he had once admired only the polished sentences of classical authors, he now found beauty in the simple, fervent cries of those ancient songs, which gave voice to praise, lament, and trust in God. The interior conflict had not vanished in the sense that he never again felt temptation or sorrow. Such struggles would remain part of his human condition. But something fundamental had shifted. He no longer stood on the fence between two lives. The long hesitation, the endless "not yet," had been overtaken by a quiet, firm yes. The garden with its fig tree, the child's voice calling, "Take and read," the words of the apostle that pierced his heart. These would stay with him as enduring images of the moment when his wandering desire finally found the courage to turn toward the one it had always, in some hidden way, been seeking. In the soft light of those days of preparation, as he walked in quieter places, spoke gently with his companions, and listened to the echoes of Scripture in his heart, Augustine began to look back on his life not only with regret for missteps, but with a growing sense of gratitude. Even his errors and detours, his time among the Manichaeans, his ambition for honors, his years in Carthage and Rome and Milan, all had played a part in bringing him to this point. The story was not finished, but the path ahead had changed direction. Where once his restlessness had driven him from city to city, seeking applause and answers that never lasted, now it turned inward and upward, toward a God he was learning to know not only through reasoning minds, but through a heart finally willing to be changed. The months that followed his decision in the garden moved with a different rhythm, quieter and more deliberate, as if time itself had taken a softer step around Augustine. He had resigned his position, released his grip on the career that once defined him, and placed himself among those preparing for baptism. The city of Milan, which had known him as an imperial rhetor, now saw him slipping out of public forums and into a more hidden life, where the most important events unfolded not in crowded halls, but in the silence of prayer and the gentle murmur of Scripture. To make space for this new beginning, Augustine withdrew with a small circle of companions and family to a country estate at a place called Casiciacum, nestled in the countryside outside Milan. You may picture it as a villa set amid quiet fields and trees, a place where birdsong and the rustle of leaves formed a backdrop to long conversations. Around him were his friend Alypius, his young son Adeodatus, his mother Monica, and a few others who shared his desire for a more reflective life. The setting differed sharply from the glitter and noise of courts and classrooms. Here, days passed with a gentle regularity: walks outdoors, readings, discussions, the simple rhythm of shared meals and evening rest. At Casiciacum, Augustine did not yet know he would one day become one of the Church's great theologians. He simply knew that his heart, long restless, was now turned toward God, and that he needed to learn how to live in this new orientation. He spent much of his time in conversation, something he had always loved, but now the topics were different. No longer eager to display his skill in argument for its own sake, he sought instead to understand, to contemplate, to listen. These discussions, some of which he later reworked into written dialogues, circled around questions of happiness, truth, and the nature of God. The tone was quieter than his earlier debates, less combative, more like a group of travelers gathering in the evening to share what they had seen and what they hoped still to find. In the cool mornings, he might walk under the trees with Adeodatus at his side, the boy asking questions with a quick, clear mind that delighted his father. Augustine later spoke with deep tenderness of Adeodatus, recognizing in him a gift and a purity that often surprised those who met him. Their talks were not only about study, they were about life, about God, about what it meant to belong to a reality larger than oneself. Monica, moving gently through this little household, watched them with a joy that had ripened over years of sorrow and waiting. To see her son no longer arguing against the faith, but seeking to understand it from within, was like watching the dawn after a long and difficult night. In those days of retreat, he discovered the Psalms. These ancient songs of Israel, which he had once neglected, now spoke to him as if they had been written with his own heart in mind. Their cries of yearning, their confessions of weakness, their exultant praise, these found an echo in his own story. He heard in them the voice of a soul that had wandered, stumbled, and been gathered back, a voice that knew both the depths of sorrow and the heights of trust. Their words became his words. He prayed them, sang them, let them shape the way he saw his past and his future. Where once he had admired polished Latin prose, he now found a different kind of beauty, a beauty born of honesty before God. Winter turned towards spring, and with it came the approach of Easter, the traditional time for baptism in the early church. In the great Basilica of Milan, the Christian community prepared for the solemn night when catechumens, those who had long been instructed, would be brought to the regenerating waters. Augustine, Alypius, and young Adeodatus were among them. The path that had led him there had been long and winding, passing through Thagaste, Carthage, Rome, and Milan, through philosophies and sects, through ambitions and disappointments. Now it narrowed to a single quiet point, a font of water, a bishop's hand, a name invoked over him. You may imagine the basilica on that night, lamps burning with steady flames, casting warm circles of light on stone columns, the faces of believers gathered in a hush, filled not with fear but with expectation, the slow, solemn chant of psalms and prayers rising like a gentle tide. Ambrose, who had preached for years to the assembled faithful, now stood as the minister of this sacrament for the former imperial rhetor, who once came only to admire his eloquence. Augustine stepped forward not as a celebrated teacher, but as a man in need of mercy, ready to be marked with a sign he had delayed for so long. According to tradition, he and Alypius descended into the baptismal waters together, while Adeodatus, still young but remarkably prepared, also received the sacrament. The old life, with its unresolved wanderings, its divided will, and its postponed promises, was symbolically buried. A new life, still fragile but real, emerged. There were no thunderclaps, no outward miracles, only the quiet, solemn actions of the church, water poured, words spoken, a seal given. Yet for Augustine, this night marked a decisive crossing. He had moved from merely admiring Christ to belonging to Him, from standing at the doors of the church to entering its embrace. After the baptism, a deep joy settled over him. It was not the wild excitement of sudden success, but the calm gladness of someone who has finally come home after a long and difficult journey. He received the Eucharist for the first time, sharing in the mystery at the center of the faith he now confessed. The psalms he loved took on an even richer meaning as he sang them in the assembly of believers, no longer as an outsider observing from a distance, but as one of the flock. The time came, eventually, to leave Milan. Augustine's thoughts turned toward Africa, the land of his childhood and youth, the place where both his earliest wounds and deepest roots lay. He no longer wished to remain in the circles of imperial power. Instead, he dreamed of returning to a quieter life, perhaps forming a small community devoted to prayer, study, and simplicity, far from the noise that had once entangled his heart. Monica, who had followed him across the sea with tears and hope, was ready to go home as well. Her desire had always been to see her son a committed Christian before she died, and that desire had now been fulfilled. Whatever years remained to her, she could receive them as a gift. They set out on the journey, traveling southward toward the coast, intending to sail back to North Africa. Along the way, they paused at the port town of Ostia near Rome, where ships awaited favorable winds to cross the Mediterranean. It was a liminal place, neither fully Italy nor Africa, a threshold between two parts of his life. The days there were marked by a strange, quiet beauty. Away from the pressures of Milan, free from his former responsibilities, Augustine could simply be a son beside his mother, a father beside his child, a new Christian learning to rest in the presence of God. One evening in Ostia, as Augustine later recounted, he and Monica stood together at a window overlooking a garden, speaking softly about the life that awaited them beyond this world. Their conversation, as he remembered it, rose from the earthly scene around them, trees, sky, the play of light, and moved toward reflections on the joy of the saints, on the peace of being fully in God's presence, beyond all change and sorrow. For a brief moment, according to his own account, their minds seemed to touch something of that reality, a kind of stillness full of light, before gently returning to the ordinary world. It was a quiet, contemplative moment, not dramatic in outward appearance, yet for him it remained one of the most precious memories of his life with his mother. Soon after this, her health began to fail. The long years of travel, sorrow, and hope had taken their toll. She fell ill there in Ostia, far from Thagaste, far from the familiar streets where she had once walked as a young wife and mother. Yet she did not greet this decline with fear. She spoke calmly of her approaching death, expressing only one deep desire: that her son remain in the faith and remember her at the altar of the Lord. The wish to be buried in her homeland, which had once mattered to her, now seemed unimportant. Nothing is far from God, she is remembered as having said in substance, content to be laid to rest wherever it pleased him. Her passing was gentle,
like a candle's flame that burns steadily until it quietly goes out. For Augustine, the loss was piercing. He had loved her as a mother, but also as the one who had carried him in prayer through every twist of his wandering path. To lose her now, just when he had finally entered the life she had so long desired for him, felt both deeply painful and strangely fitting, as if her mission on earth had reached its completion. He wept, not ashamed of his tears, for grief and love are close companions. Yet under his sorrow lay a quiet trust that she had gone to the one she had sought so faithfully, and that their separation, though real, was not final. After her death and burial in Ostia, Augustine lingered for a time, letting the new contours of his life settle around him. The return to Africa was delayed by grief and practical concerns, but at last he crossed the sea again, retracing in reverse the path he had taken years before as an ambitious young student. He returned not to Carthage's bright distractions, but eventually to Thagaste, the small town where his story had begun. There, he set about forming the kind of community he had envisioned. A small group of men living together, sharing goods in common, dedicating their days to prayer, study of scripture, and quiet work. In that modest setting, among the hills and fields of North Africa, Augustine began the next chapter of his journey. He was no longer the restless student wandering from city to city, nor the imperial rhetor weaving words for applause. He was a baptized Christian, a son who had buried his mother with tears and thanks, a father still caring tenderly for his gifted child, and a seeker who now sought truth not as a distant idea, but as a living presence in the God he had chosen to follow. The world around him was still vast and troubled, but within him, a new center had been found, and from that center his life would soon be drawn into an unexpected service he had not originally planned to undertake. When Augustine returned at last to North Africa, after the long arc that had carried him through Carthage, Rome, and Milan, it was not as the ambitious youth who had once left his homeland in search of honors, but as a man who had passed through a deep interior turning. The sea he crossed was the same, the coastline familiar. Yet the one who disembarked now bore within him a different center of gravity. He came not to climb the ladders of public life, but to seek a quieter path, one shaped by prayer, study, and a simpler way of living. Back in Thagaste, the town of his childhood, he gathered around him a small group of companions who shared his desire for a life directed toward God. Together they formed a kind of community, not hidden behind high walls, but set apart in intention. They held their goods in common, spent their days reading scripture, discussing what they read, working with their hands, and praying. It was not the life of a hermit in the desert, like Anthony, but a small domestic monastery of sorts, rooted in the soil and streets Augustine had first known as a child. You may imagine their house as a modest place, perhaps with a central courtyard open to the sky, rooms surrounding it where they slept, studied, and prayed. The mornings would begin in quiet, with simple psalms shared together, the words rising into the still air. Afterward, some might attend to practical tasks, while others sat over manuscripts, copying texts slowly, line by line, their pens scratching gently on parchment. In the afternoons, they gathered for conversation, not the competitive debates of rhetoric schools, but searching, thoughtful exchanges about God, the soul, and the path of virtue. When evening approached, lamps were lit, shadows stretched long across the walls, and once again the psalms and prayers marked the close of the day. For Augustine, this life answered a deep desire. After years spent in the constant movement of public ambition, he savored the chance to live more hiddenly, to let his love for God grow in a quieter soil. He delighted in studying scripture not as a distant critic, but as a follower seeking to be shaped by it.
He treasured the companionship of those who shared his purpose, including Adeodatus, for as long as his son lived. The boy's death, which came while he was still very young, brought Augustine a sorrow that ran deep, yet he entrusted the child to the mercy of God, holding to the memory of the wisdom and tenderness he had seen in him. In this community at Thagaste, Augustine began to write more, slowly discovering that his thoughts, when set down on parchment, could be of service not only to those immediately around him, but to others beyond the circle of his home. He did not yet see himself as a great author of the church. He wrote as a man trying to understand his own faith more deeply and to help his companions do the same. His words carried the traces of his long journey, the questions of the philosopher, the honesty of the penitent, the grateful wonder of someone who had been found after wandering far. For a while, it seemed possible that this would be his path, a life of relative obscurity, shared between prayer, study, and small acts of service, far from the thunder of public affairs. But the God he had come to follow often calls those who seek quiet into forms of service they would not have chosen for themselves. In Augustine's case, that summons came from a town along the North African coast, a place called Hippo Regius. Hippo was not far from Thagaste, a modest city overlooking the sea, with its harbor, its markets, and its own local church. One day, Augustine traveled there, intending, by his own account, to visit a friend and to consider whether a monastery might be founded in that city as well. He entered the church of Hippo simply as a visiting layman and member of the faithful, not as a public figure, content to stand among the congregation and to listen quietly. The bishop of Hippo at that time was an older man named Valerius, gentle and pious, who spoke with a heart concerned for his people. Valerius faced a problem. The needs of his growing flock required more preaching and pastoral care than he could provide alone, especially since his knowledge of Latin was limited and many in the congregation spoke that language daily. He had long desired help from a priest who could preach well and instruct the people deeply. When he learned that Augustine was present, a man known in the region as a convert of Ambrose, learned, eloquent, and now living a life of Christian dedication, he saw in him a possible answer to his prayer. During the liturgy, Valerius spoke to the assembled faithful about the need for a priest to assist in the care of souls. He asked them to pray that God would send such a helper. The people, turning their gaze toward the stranger in their midst, whose reputation had quietly preceded him, began to murmur Augustine's name. The murmurs grew into a kind of gentle insistence. In some accounts, people moved toward him, surrounding him, urging him forward. Augustine, who had entered the church looking only for a place of quiet, suddenly found himself at the center of the congregation's hope. He was not delighted. The call to priesthood in that moment felt heavy to him, not only because it would mean leaving the contemplative life he loved, but because he understood the seriousness of the office. To be responsible for souls, to preach the word of God to ordinary people, to guide them through joys and sorrows, this was no small matter. Augustine felt unworthy and unprepared. It is said that he wept, not from pride wounded by honor, but from a sense of the burden being placed upon him. Yet the Church of Hippo, through bishop and people together, understood this as a calling. Under such a strong and unanimous desire, Augustine bowed his will. He accepted ordination as a priest, placing his future into hands larger than his own plans. The quiet community life he had imagined withdrew into the background, though he did not abandon the ideal of common life. Rather, he carried it with him into this new stage. As a priest in Hippo, Augustine asked Valerius for a place where he could live with his companions according to a monastic pattern, even while serving the church. The bishop granted this wish, giving him land near the church where a small monastery could be established. There, Augustine continued to live in community,
blending the contemplative and the active. By day, preaching, teaching, settling disputes, visiting the sick. By evening, returning to prayer, study, and the shared life of his brothers. His preaching quickly became renowned, not because he sought fame, but because he spoke in a way that ordinary people could understand, bringing the depths of Scripture close to their daily concerns. He did not preach as a distant scholar, but as someone who knew from inside the struggles of a divided heart, the allure of false teachings, and the grace of being drawn back. In his homilies, he addressed farmers, merchants, widows, married couples, and the poor, helping them see that the God he had found after so many wanderings was present in their own lives as well. Valerius, who had long desired such help, rejoiced at the presence of this gifted priest. With time, however, he began to fear something else, that another church, recognizing Augustine's abilities, might draw him away and make him their bishop. To prevent this, and to ensure that the Church of Hippo would continue to benefit from his service, Valerius took a step unusual for that period. He arranged for Augustine to be made bishop while he himself was still living, so that Augustine would become his coadjutor, assisting now and succeeding him in time. Again, Augustine found himself called into a responsibility he had not sought. The weight of priestly duties had already seemed heavy. The thought of being a bishop, with its wider concerns, its added responsibilities, its demands of judgment and decision, pressed even more on his sense of personal inadequacy. Yet the needs of the church, the trust of Valerius, and the expectation of the people formed a call he could not simply refuse. In accepting, he laid aside any remaining hope of returning to a purely retired, contemplative life. His path, from this point forward, would be that of a shepherd for a city, and in time, a voice for many beyond its walls. When Valerius died, Augustine took on the full role of Bishop of Hippo. The city on the North African coast, with its harbor and its modest markets, became his fixed place. He who had once moved from town to town, seeking better schools and higher positions, now rooted himself in a single community, vowing not to leave it for other honors. His monastery near the church continued, now as a place where future clergy were formed in a spirit of simplicity and common life. The bishop's house became a place always open to those in need, to the poor seeking help, to the puzzled seeking counsel. Thus, the quiet community life at Thagast did not vanish. It was transformed. Its spirit of shared goods, prayer, and mutual care now flowed into the pastoral ministry of Hippo. Augustine, the reluctant bishop, held together within himself the contemplative and the active, the man of prayer and the man of the people. He still longed for hours of study and writing, and he found them when he could, often late at night or early in the dawn, when the city was asleep and the sea's murmur reached the walls in a soft, steady rhythm. But he also walked the streets, listened to disputes, comforted the sorrowful, and confronted errors that threatened the faith of his flock. In this way, the man who had once tried to withdraw into a small, hidden community found himself at the heart of a city's life, entrusted with guiding its souls. His reluctance did not vanish. He never ceased to feel the weight of his office. Yet within that burden, he discovered another form of peace. The peace of serving where he was placed, of offering his mind, his words, and his life for the good of those among whom he lived, under the gaze of the God who had followed him through every turn of his journey. The city that became his home as bishop was not large by the standards of great imperial capitals, yet for Augustine it was a whole world entrusted to his care. Hippo Regius lay beside the wide water, its harbor opening toward the Mediterranean, ships coming and going with goods and news from other ports. The streets were lined with modest houses,
workshops and small shops where people bought bread, oil, and cloth. At certain times of day, the sound of hammers, of mule carts on stone, of voices bargaining and greeting, filled the air. At others, especially in the cooler hours of dawn and evening, a softer quiet settled over walls and courtyards, broken only by the call of vendors and the distant, steady sigh of the sea. Into this living web of people and sounds, Augustine's days were woven. As bishop, he was not simply a distant figure who appeared only in the church. His house and the buildings nearby formed a kind of open center for the life of the Christian community. The line between monastery and bishop's residence was thin. Brothers lived with him, according to a rule of shared goods and simplicity, while the door remained open to those who came seeking counsel, justice, or help. The rhythm of his life combined the regularity of prayer with the unpredictability of human need. In the early morning, before the streets fully woke, he might already be at prayer with his clergy and the brothers of his community. Psalms chanted in a simple tone rose through the dim interior of the church, weaving themselves into the first light that slipped softly through small windows or fell from lamps still burning. He had grown to love these songs, which had once been strangers to him. Now they formed the frame around each day, reminding him that his work did not begin with himself, but with the God whose mercy he never tired of praising. After the morning liturgy, his tasks unfolded along many paths. Some hours were given to study and writing. He wrote letters to other bishops, to monks, to lay believers scattered across the region, answering questions, encouraging, sometimes correcting. His correspondence began to stretch beyond Africa to Italy, to Gaul, even to distant lands, as his reputation slowly spread. He also wrote longer works, some born of controversy, others of contemplation. When he composed his confessions, it was not as a public show, but as a long prayer, a narrative addressed to God in which he read his own past under the light of grace. The book unfolded his life from Thagaste to Milan and beyond, but always with the sense that he was recounting not his own greatness, but the patience and mercy of the one who had pursued him. Yet writing, as dear as it was to him, could not consume his whole day. People came to him with disputes to be settled, neighbors arguing over property lines, merchants in conflict with partners, husbands and wives struggling under the strain of misunderstanding or betrayal. He listened, asked questions, tried to untangle knots of anger and confusion. In a time when the civil structures of justice grew weaker, bishops often served as arbiters and protectors, especially for the poor. Augustine took this seriously. To him, the care of souls included the defense of the vulnerable, the search for peace in conflicts, the gentle but firm correction of wrongs. He also faced controversies that touched the very identity of the Church in North Africa. The long-standing division with the Donatists, who questioned the validity of sacraments celebrated by clergy they considered compromised, continued to trouble the region. Augustine worked patiently to explain that the holiness of the Church did not depend on the personal perfection of its ministers, but on the faithfulness of Christ. He debated, wrote, and traveled to councils, always seeking reconciliation rather than humiliation of opponents. His words were strong at times, yet beneath them lay a desire to heal a wound that had opened in the body of believers. Another challenge arose later, in the form of the teachings associated with Pelagius, which emphasized human effort to the point of diminishing the role of grace. Augustine, who knew from his own life how weak the human will can be without divine help, responded passionately. For him, it was clear that every good act, every sincere turning toward God, was already supported by a grace that precedes and accompanies us. His writings on grace and freedom emerged not from abstract speculation alone, but from the memory of his own divided heart
and the gentle, persistent mercy that had brought him home. Preaching formed one of the most constant threads of his ministry. Week after week, and often more frequently than that, he stepped into the ambo of his church to speak to the people gathered before him. They were not philosophers or scholars. They were farmers, laborers, tradespeople, widows, young mothers with children in their arms, elderly men leaning on sticks. He addressed them in language they could understand, using images from fields and markets, from family life and daily worries. He spoke about the parables of Christ, the Psalms of David, the letters of Paul, always trying to show how these ancient words touched the lives they were actually living. Sometimes his sermons responded to immediate concerns, an outbreak of fear over rumors of invasion, the temptation to seek superstitious remedies, the tension between rich and poor. He called his flock to trust in God, to practice mercy, to guard their hearts against bitterness. At other times, he lifted their minds to the great mysteries of faith, the Trinity, the Incarnation, the hope of resurrection. He did not separate theology from pastoral care. In his words, profound truths and ordinary life met like two streams joining into one. The world around Hippo was changing. The Roman Empire, under whose order Augustine had been born, was weakening. News arrived by ship and traveler. Cities in distant provinces threatened or attacked, borders crossed by new peoples, the old confidence in the empire's strength slowly eroding. In 410, the news reached Africa that Rome itself had been sacked by the Goths under Alaric. The shock was immense. For many, Rome had seemed eternal, the visible anchor of order in the world. Now its walls had been breached, its streets filled with fear. Pagans blamed the Christian God for abandoning a city that had once honored other gods. Some believers felt shaken, wondering how such a disaster fit into the story of salvation. Augustine responded with a work that would occupy him for years, The City of God. In its pages, he drew a long, patient contrast between the earthly city, marked by self-love, pride, and the passing nature of all human achievements, and the heavenly city formed by love of God and destined to endure beyond all change. He did not despise the earthly city. He acknowledged the relative goods of order, justice, and peace that can be found within it. But he refused to grant it an ultimate place. Empires rise and fall, civic glory flourishes and fades, yet the deeper story of God's work in human hearts continues. For his flock in Hippo, and for many beyond, this vision offered a way to live amid political upheaval without despair, placing trust not in the walls of any earthly city, but in a kingdom that cannot be shaken. The years passed, marked by seasons of relative calm and times of fear. Augustine grew older, his hair thinning, his body bearing the marks of unceasing labor, yet his mind remained clear and his heart engaged. He continued to oversee the formation of clergy, to encourage other bishops, to support monasteries, including women's communities, with letters of counsel. His rule, drawn from the way of life he had shaped with his companions, began to influence communities beyond Hippo, offering a simple pattern of shared life, prayer, and mutual charity. In his later years, a new threat rose more closely around him: the advance of the Vandals into North Africa. These Germanic peoples, having crossed into Spain and then into Africa, moved steadily along the coast, taking city after city. Reports of their conquests reached Hippo, carried on anxious lips. Refugees poured into the town, bringing with them stories of fear, of lost homes, of uncertainty about the future. Augustine's house and church opened to them as best they could, and he encouraged those under his care not to surrender to panic. Despite the dangers, he did not abandon his post. At a time when some might have sought safer places,
he remained in Hippo, refusing to leave the flock entrusted to him. He continued to preach, to celebrate the sacraments, to comfort those who feared for their lives and families. The city prepared for siege as the Vandals approached. Walls were strengthened, supplies gathered, hope tested. When at last the siege began, Hippo became an island of resistance in a sea of uncertainty. Within the besieged city, Augustine fell ill. It was the summer of 430, and he was now an old man, worn by years of service. The illness weakened him gradually, confining him to his bed. From that place of forced stillness, he could hear, faintly, the sounds of a city under siege, the clatter of arms on walls, the murmur of voices, the occasional distant cry. Yet his concerns, even then, were not for himself alone. He urged his brothers to protect the library of books he had gathered and written. They were, he knew, not his personal property, but a treasury for the church. He encouraged them to remain faithful, to guard their unity, to remember that whether the city stood or fell, the hope they held in Christ remained. Those who visited his room during his last days found him, it is said, meditating on penitential psalms. Having them written out and hung on the wall, he would look at the words, letting them guide his own final prayer, confessions of sin, pleas for mercy, expressions of trust. The man who had once described his life as a restless wandering now approached the end still as a seeker, but a seeker at peace, resting in the one he had long ago learned to call not only God, but my Lord and my friend. Outside, the siege pressed on. Inside, the bishop's life drew gently to its close. He had guided Hippo through theological disputes, through political shifts, through years of ordinary joys and sorrows. Now, as his strength ebbed, he entrusted the city, his people, and his work to the God who had never abandoned him. In late August of 430, Augustine of Hippo died quietly, leaving behind a town still besieged, a library of writings, and a memory that would continue to live far beyond the crumbling walls of the earthly city he had served. Not long after his death, Hippo fell to the Vandals. The city that had been his home burned. Many buildings were destroyed. Yet, by a providence that those who loved him cherished, the cathedral and the library attached to it were spared. The works he had poured out over so many years survived to travel across the sea of time, carrying his voice into lands and centuries he could never have imagined. The bishop was gone. The city lay changed and wounded. But the words he had spoken about the city of God, about a peace that no siege can take, continued to echo in the hearts of those who, like him, walked through a fragile world with their eyes lifted toward a more enduring light.